Akdamus. A little bit of an experiment here. I gave a class on Akdamus and the history of Akdamus and understanding what it's about. I did not get a chance to record that class, but I did get significant feedback and interest, and so I'm going to try and sort of record it just in the privacy of my office and see how this comes out. So I think it's true to say that virtually all Ashkenazi communities say Akdamus on Shavuos, with the exception of Chabad. We'll see later on in the class that once upon a time the Kehillah of Vermaiza, of Worms, did not say Akdamus on Shavuos, and we'll also see why that is. But nowadays, to the best of my knowledge, the only Ashkenazi community that does not say Akdamus on Shavuos is Chabad, and of course we'll discuss why that is and the history of that. Akdamus is not just another piyut that is said, like you might say, Tfilas Tal on the first day of Pesach, or Tfilas Geshem on Shmini Atzeres. I don't think anybody would say that the Shmini Atzeres is sort of shaped by Tfilas Geshem, and when you think of Shmini Atzeres, what comes to mind is the tunes of Tfilas Geshem necessarily. But for Akdamus, that's very much not the case. Akdamus is very central, and kids in Chadarim learn it by heart. They learn it with the translation. And for those who do say Akdamus is kind of a very central theme and part of the atmosphere of the first day Yom Tif. In many Hasidic kreisen, they have nigunim associated with Akdamus that they sing. For example, most famously in Ger, they sing a very long nigun that's longer than 20 minutes before Akdamus. The tune of Akdamus itself, Akdamus milin v'shara yushusa avlo shakilna harmanu reshusa, approximately. So it's a very famous tune. It's a very old tune. The Chokri Nagina say that this nigun goes back over 500 years. It has since been also adapted to other things. For example, we use it for the Mereshus, where we call up the Chasen Torah and the Chasen Bereshis. Mereshus hakeil hagodel v'hanoira eftach pi'im b'shira v'zimra. Parts of it are also used for the tune of Kiddush on Yom Tif night, Kivon nevachar tov yesanu kidashta mikol ho'amim, etc. We'll start off with talking about the Minhag Chabad as it pertains to Akdamus, and then we'll go back to discussing the actual the broader history and the different topics that the post can talk about. But actually, one thing I should do first is tell you what Akdamus actually is. So it's printed in all the Sidurim, also in the Chabad Sidurim, before Kriyas HaTorah of Shavuos. The author of Akdamus is Reb Meir Schatz, Reb Meir Shliach Tzibur. Reb Meir Schatz was actually the Shliach Tzibur in the Kehillah of Vermaiza in Worms, and he is a very prominent authority. Rashi quotes him a number of times, both in his Pirush on Tanakh and also in the Siddur of Rashi. For example, with regards to which psukim we should say exactly how to, if you should include the psukim of the Musaf of Rish Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah, Rashi defers to what Meir Mitzchak Schatz instituted. Rashi says, I emulated what he did. There's the question on the Shabbos davening. Why do we call Shabbos, we say in Shemini Esrei of Shabbos, Chemdas Yomim Meitzah Karosa? Where is Shabbos referred to as Chemdas HaYomim? There doesn't seem to be any source for that. And Rashi writes, Reb Meir Schatz HaHogun Hoyu Mesaken HaDover Hazeh. So to say, we don't, whatever the reason is, Reb Meir Schatz, he is an authority who can sort of come up with this on his own, or whatever it is. Now, also it's worth to mention that in the Yizkar book of the Kehillah of Vermaiza, they used to say Yizkar, they used to include names of prominent people, in general prominent people, and specifically prominent people that lived in Worms. And in one of the entries over there, I'm reading out of this, it says, Yizkar Elikim es Nishmas Rabbeinu Meir Bar Yitzchak im Nishmois v'chulu, which is the standard Lashon, that Hashem should remember his neshama together with the neshamas of Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, etc. Ba'avur shatikin shevachis lamokaim, because he was mesaken praises to Hashem. So He's most famous for the Akdamus, but he composed many other things as well. In the actual piyut of Akdamus, so it starts off with going through the Aleph base on a double acrostic. So Aleph is Akdamus Milin V'Sharoyos Shusa Avlo Shokil Nahaman Shusa. Then it goes 2 bases, 2 gimels, all the way through Tov. Then after Tov, it spells out his name, Reb Meir Rabbi Yitzchak Yigdal B'Torah V'Masim Tovim Amen Chazak V'Amatz, or something along those lines. There are many different commentaries on Akdamus published. There's also actually commentaries on Akdamus from Rishonim that to date have not been properly published. They're still in manuscript, but certainly it's a very famous piyut and a very important one, which has taken the attention of many people over the generations to take the time to comment on it personally. There is available the Machzer from Rabbi Frankel, who is the Talmud of Rabbi Goldschmidt. In Chabad, he may be familiar for the Kinnis. The Rebbe used to use his Kinnis, so he also produced a Machzor for Shavuos, and I've been reading this year his commentary on Akdamus, which is very interesting. Now, the first reference that we have, of course, the Alter Rebbe talks about the Halachic issues of Akdamus, which we'll get to soon, but the first reference we have about Minhag Chabad vis-a-vis Akdamus is in the Shar HaKolel. Shar HaKolel, Rabbi Avram David Lavut, is the Rebbe's great-grandfather. His dates are Tov Kuf Ayin Hey to Tov Reish Nun, so that is 1815 to 1890. And in Shar HaKolel he writes that even though there's no basis specifically from the Gemara or from Kabbalah's Arizal, Pri Etz Chaim, and the Arizal Siddur, etc., that one should say Akdamus, there's also no reason not to say it, because it doesn't, there's no problem to say it, it's just a nice thing to say. And he says the fact that it's not in the Alter Rebbe Siddur is of no indication of anything, because he says that the Siddurim that were printed in the lifetime of the Alter Rebbe did not have Kriyas HaTorah printed in them. And so the fact that Akdamus, which is always printed immediately preceding, sort of between the Kriyas HaTorah of Pesach and Shavuos, so if it's not in the Alter Rebbe Siddur, which doesn't have Kriyas HaTorah, that's not an indication of anything. What is in practice the Minhag Chabad? So he says like this: there are many minyanim who do not say it, and the reason is because the leaders of those communities who do not say it are the people who daven ba'arichus, and they have to pause in the middle of Sukkot Zimra, or in the middle of wherever they're up to in davening, to listen to Kriyas HaTorah, and so it's not convenient for them, and it's not enhancing to the kavanah of davening to have to stop for longer and listen to Akdamus, and so they were masaken, they sort of abolished saying Akdamus in those communities. But in other communities where the people, everyone davens with the minyan, there's no reason not to say it. There is an additional testimony of the Chabad custom, which is found in Ur Yisrael, volume 76, where there is reproduced a luach that was originally published in the year Tov Reish Samach Vav, so that's about 16 years after the passing of Rabbi Avram David Lavut, and this is a luach with the minhagim for the shul, kafi nusach ha'arizal, im kol hadinim ha'minhagim asher yisad ha'admur ha'zokein, the Alter Rebbe. So this is clearly a very Chabad luach, and this is printed in Vilna in the year, for the year Tov Reish Samach Vav, and over there in the entry under Shavuos, Akdamus is included. Now, contemporary Chabad, so the easiest place to see everything collected into one location is in Utzer Minhagi Chabad from Rabbi Monshein, and over there he brings a number of different references of when the Rebbe discussed Akdamus at the Yom Tov meals. In the first 20 years or so after the Rebbe's Nesius, he would have the Yom Tov meals together with other invited Chassidim in the Frierdiker Rebbe's apartment upstairs in 770, and so Akdamus often came up, and all of them are quite positive. On one occasion, the Rebbe said that that the Frierdiker Rebbe told that he heard from the Frierdiker Rebbe that he doesn't know why it wasn't said in Lubavitch, and that it's possible that the Rebbe Rashab actually did want to say it, but he more than he wanted to say Akdamus, he wanted to not get involved in sort of shul politics and in gabos of the shul, and so it ended up that it wasn't said. Another entry says that in the Lubavitch it wasn't said, but in other places of Anash it was said. We already saw that. It's interesting that the Rebbe reports that he himself did grow up with Akdamus, and Yakutrin Slav Akdamus was said. And the Rebbe himself actually also used to say Akdamus privately. It wasn't said, sort of sung together with the minyan in 770, but the Rebbe himself did say it privately before Kriyas HaTorah or between Aliyas on the first day of Shavuos. There's one letter of the Rebbe where the Rebbe is quite sharp about Akdamus, saying, like what lepele pliyosai, that you find it wondrous that Chabad don't say Akdamus. Certainly, that Sfardim don't say Akdamus, etc. If you see the context of that response, it's quite clear why the Rebbe is sort of defensive about it. It's a letter that somebody wrote to the Rebbe, basically saying, I ended up in a Lubavitch shul on Shavuos, and there were all these strange things going on. They didn't say Akdamus, and they did Hagbah in this strange way, where the person who did Hagbah sat down with the Sefer Torah, and a number of other comments that this individual had on Minhag Chabad. And to that the Rebbe responds, first of all, this that you went for the first time into Chabad, into Chassidish shul on Shavuos, this is a very good thing, and it should be a pull and Mshechas, etc. And of course, then the Rebbe goes on to defend Minhag Chabad. And so, even though the Rebbe himself did clearly have a strong affinity toward Akdamus, but if you're going to start attacking Chabad, saying that it's not okay that we don't say Akdamus, then of course the Rebbe is going to defend that. Now, moving on to Akdamus itself and the halachic discussions surrounding it. So, perhaps the most famous issue about Akdamus is the question of when exactly Akdamus is to be recited. Everybody agrees that the ancient original Minhag Ashkenaz was that Akdamus is said after the first pasuk of Kriyas HaTorah. So, for example, I'm going to read you now from the Maharil in the Minhagim of Shavuos. He says, "B'Shavuos oimrim hadibra Akdamus milin." We recite the dibra Akdamus milin, and we'll see soon why he's referring to Akdamus as a dibra, what that word means. But we recite the dibra Akdamus milin. When is it recited? Achar siyum pasuk rishon d'Kriyas HaTorah shu b'chodesh hashlishi, after the completion of the first pasuk of Leining, which is b'chodesh hashlishi. V'chein arkin, and he says there's another piyut which starts with the word arkin, which is said after the first pasuk of Vaydaber Elikim, which is the pasuk right before the Aseret Adibris. Anyway, so that was the original minhag, to be recited after the first pasuk of Kriyas HaTorah. Now this caused a lot of problems, and most famously the Taz, in Siman Tov Tzadik Daled, in Hilchos Shavuos, he writes, "Al Masha Noegim Dinas Elo Likris Pasuk Rishon VaAchkach Maschilan Akdamus." This that the minhag is to first read the first pasuk of Leining and then recite Akdamus. Yesh Litmaya Harbe. This is a big problem. Heach Rashoyim Lahavsik B'Kriya. How is it permissible to interrupt in the middle of the Leining? Da'afilu L'Sapa B'Divrei Torah Asur. It's forbidden even to learn Divrei Torah in the middle of Kriyas HaTorah, and etc. And he finishes. How could you interrupt with something she'eina me'inyan she'eina me'inyan akriya klal? The content of Akdamus is not in any way related to the content of Kriyas HaTorah, so certainly it makes no sense to interrupt. Indeed, I heard recently that there was some prominent Rabbanim who instituted that Akdamus should be recited before the Kohen starts his Aliyah. V'chein says the Taz, this is indeed the preferable custom. Now, this chiddush of the Taz to change the minhag from reciting Akdamus in the middle of Kriyas HaTorah after the first pasuk to saying it before Kriyas HaTorah was not very quick in being received, and many poskim were very hesitant to accept the Taz. And really this gets into the whole question of kind of minhag halacha. In other words, you have here a minhag which on the one hand, seems to fly in the face of halacha. How is this permissible? But on the other hand, it's a very ancient minhag, which is strongly and firmly established for many years. Gedolei Yisrael were doing this. As we said before, Meir Schatz, the composer of Akdamus, himself was a very prominent person who the Rishonim relied on blindly. So if he instituted this to be recited during Kriyas HaTorah, then if we're going to change that, we are undermining and casting aspersions on their authority and etc. So that's really the tension that's going on over here, which we'll overview a little bit. Nevertheless, it's also true to say that it didn't happen quickly, but over the years things did change, and that nowadays, with the exception of some hardcore Minhag Ashkenaz communities, the Yakas, etc., most shuls, most communities, Ashkenazim, Chassidim, all of them, say Akdamus nowadays before Kriyas HaTorah, not during Kriyas HaTorah. It's interesting to note that even though usually when there's a machlokes Magen Avraham and Taz, I think it's more common to follow the Magen Avraham. In this case, the Magen Avraham is accepting, and by the way, the Magen Avraham is a little bit younger than the Taz. The Magen Avraham is accepting of the minhag to say it during Kriyas HaTorah, but yet, like we see, the Chasam Sofer actually, he quotes the Taz and the Magen Avraham, and he says, the Chasam Sofer himself, in his Agos and Shulchan Aruch, Tav Tzadik Dalet, says to do it like the Taz if possible, and that was, in fact, the minhag in the Chasam Sofer himself grew up, is from Frankfurt, where they used to say Akdamus in middle of laning, but in Preshburg, where the Chasam Sofer himself was the Rav, Akdamus was said before laning. The context of the Magen Avraham, though, is not in Hilchos Shavuos. He doesn't talk about it there at all. The Magen Avraham mentions it in passing in Siman Kuf Mem Vav, which is in Hilchos Kriyas HaTorah, and over there, the Torah says that it's forbidden to leave the Asolatzes even being pasuk le'pasuk. You're not allowed to go out of shul in the middle of Kriyas HaTorah, even between one pasuk and the next. The Mechaber in Shulchan Aruch skips those words. He says you're not allowed to go out even being gavra le'gavra between one aliyah and the next. But there's no mention in Shulchan Aruch of not leaving between one pasuk and the other. But the Magen Avraham quotes the Torah, and he says v'nafkamina b'shavuos sha'imim Akdamus, that the practical relevance of the Torah, when would there be possible to leave shul between one pasuk and come back before the next pasuk? That would be on Shavuos, when we recite Akdamus in between the two first two psukim. One of the famous defenders of the original minhag is the Shar Ephraim. The Shar Ephraim is Rabbi Ephraim ben Rabbi Yaakov HaKohen, born in Vilna in the year 1616. So, he's a friend of he's a chaver of the Shach, and he's actually also famously the grandfather of the Chacham Tzvi, the great grandfather of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who also opines. Actually, interesting that Rabbi Yaakov Emden argues with the Shar Ephraim on this. But the Shar Ephraim posed a question from the community in Venice, where really the stronghold of the community was a Sephardi community, but there was also a smaller Ashkenazi community. I don't know if it's accurate to call them Sephardim, but Akal Panim, they were not Ashkenazim and did not have the minhag of Akdamus at all. And the Ashkenazim, they were saying Akdamus, and this created a feud in the community, because those who did not say Akdamus, he refers to them as the Beis Din HaSfardi. So the Sfardim were very disturbed by this interruption of Kriyas HaTorah to say Akdamus. And so they posed the question to the Shar Ephraim in their words, Al Hadin v'al Ha'emes v'al Hasholim. Al Hadin, the question was, does the Sephardi Beis Din, who do not say Akdamus at all, have the right to get involved over here in something which which is not their minhag at all? So who gives them a right to get involved in whether we say it before or during Kriyas HaTorah? And really the tshuva is quite a long tshuva, and the bulk of it is really dedicated to that question, as in the authority and how is the interrelationship between the two communities. And then the second part of the question is Al Ha'emes. When is the accurate time to say Akdamus? Should it be said before Kriyas HaTorah or during Kriyas HaTorah? And finally, Al Hasholim, maybe it's better to do to change things just to maintain peace, even if that's not the right thing to do. Now the Shar Ephraim has this theory, which he suggests towards the end of the tshuva, that he says, I'll tell you why Akdamus is said after one pasuk specifically, because we want Akdamus to be said during Kriyas HaTorah. So if you say it before the first pasuk, that would be an interruption between the bracha and the mitzvah. That would for sure be a problem. If you would say it after 3 psukim, which 3 psukim is the minimum amount for an aliyah to be, so after 3 psukim technically could be considered the end of the aliyah entirely. And even 2 psukim, he brings an opinion, could be an entire aliyah. And so if you want it to be firmly embedded, sandwiched in the middle of the aliyah, so then the best place to do it is after the first pasuk. Anyway, he ends with that, and the Chasam Sofer, who addresses the Sha'ar Ephraim, he says, if you look at it, you'll see that everything he says is very, not convincing, and he's clearly just trying to justify the existing minhag. Another important shuvah perhaps to mention is the Panim Iris, Ramei Ash, also a little bit later, 1670 he's born, and he says that I remember somebody wanted to implement the Taz's opinion, but he was not allowed to. And he says, B'chlal, I don't really understand what the Taz problem is. The Taz says that you're not even allowed to talk Divrei Torah in the middle of Kriyas HaTorah, but there the reason is because if you talk Divrei Torah, you're not going to hear the laning from the Bal Korah, from the Shtech Tzibur. But here, where the Bal Korah is pausing, and while he's pausing, somebody else is saying Akdamus, so what's the problem? It's not, we'll see, get back to that soon. Nowadays, the common practice is that the Bal Korah himself says Akdamus, but we're going to touch upon that soon. But be that as it may, the main point of the Panim Iris is that if the Bal Korah himself is pausing while Akdamus is said, so then why should this present such a big deal? It's not such a big problem. And he goes on to emphasize that if you do make the change that the Taz suggested, so then you are, like we mentioned before, you are being pegea in the kavod of the Rishonim. This is disrespectful to the early Poskim and Ashkenaz who instituted to say Akdamus after the first pasuk of Kriyah. Now, essentially, the main issue that we want to address is what's Taka Pshat in the original minhag. Why is it that originally Akdamus was instituted to be said after the first pasuk of Kriyas HaTorah? Now, the first person really to start cracking the nut on this puzzle is Rav Wolf Heidenheim. Wolf Heidenheim was a very famous Baal Medaktik, and he printed the famous Redelheimer Machzorim, which he worked hard on getting accurate nuschos and also on writing commentaries on the Piyutim. His dates are Tov Kuf Yud Zayin to Tov Kuf Tzadik Beis. And he is someone who was very much supported by the Gedolei Hador, the Haflah, the Chasam Sofer, and others. Now, he found in manuscripts of Machzorim, of old Machzorim, where after the first pasuk of Kriyas HaTorah, it says, before Akdamus, it says Reshus leMetargim. This is a Reshus for the Metargim. Okay, what's a Reshus and what's a Metargim? And then it says Akdamus, and at the end of the Akdamus, it says Tzvi v'Yisri Von Masar l'Neraisa. That's the last line of Akdamus. And then the Machzor continues in this manuscripts, Metargim v'Omer b'Yarchat Lisa. He continues to say the Targum b'Yarchat Lisa in Aramaic for the first pasuk, B'Chodesh HaShlishi. So, this was discovered by Rav Wolf Heidenheim, and together with that, he quotes a Chazkuni. The Chazkuni is in his commentary on Parshas Yisro, where he writes, he talks about the two different trop, or the two different tunes that there are for the Aseres HaDibros, which we call Tam Elin and Tam Tachton, and he says in that discussion that when you read the Torah on Shavuos, which is commemorating actually to be a dugma of Matan Torah, and Metargaminan HaDibros, and we translate the Dibros, so then you say it in the Tam Elin. I'm not going to get into the whole Tam Elin, Tam Tachton discussion right now, but this is a minhag which Rav Wolf Heidenheim is finding in the Machzor, and he's finding in the Chazkuni about Targum. Now, the truth is that, of course, Targum in and of itself is already a very ancient takana of Ezra. The Rambam writes that's a takana of Ezra, institution of Ezra, to be metargim the Torah into Aramaic. Now, in Siman Kuf Mem Hey, the Torah goes through the whole discussion of whether or not we still have to do Turgama nowadays, that Aramaic is no longer the mother tongue of most Jewish people, and of course we're all familiar that, except actually with the exception of the Teimanim, who still keep up the minhag of the Targum, and there's actually videos available on YouTube where you could listen to them doing it on weekdays, on fast days, but the minhag already for a long time not to have a Turgaman. However, what we're seeing here in these Machzorim and the Chizkuni is that there in fact still was a minhag to have a Turgaman, at least on Shavuos. This is also can be understood from Tosfos. There's a Tosfos in Megillah Daf Chaf Daled Amud Aleph, where Tosfos earlier in Daf Chaf Gimel Amud Beis, Tosfos says that we don't have a Turgaman nowadays, and he discusses what the basis to do away with the Turgaman is. And then in Daf Chaf Daled he says, Tosfos right, this, that we nowadays do the Turgaman for the Haftorahs and Pesach and Shavuos more than other Yom Tovim is in order to do Presumei Nisa, to be Mefarsim the Nes of Kriyas Yamsov and Matan Torah. Now, this is a little bit strange because why is he talking about being Mitargum the Haftorah and not the actual Kriyas HaTorah? It's a little bit beyond the scope right now, but it seems this at this stage in the game there was somehow a minhag, the original minhag to be Mitargum the Kriya on those days was no longer extant, but somehow the Haftorahs remained. Anyway, whatever the case is, we find reference to this in Tosfos, and that the purpose of it is Presumei Nisa. There's actually another indication to this, an old one, in Shuvas Maharam Rotenberg. In Shuvas Maharam Rotenberg, he has a question: is the person, the Balkoyer himself, allowed to say Dabra? Now, we don't know yet what Dabra is, but we already mentioned before that the Maharil refers to Akdamus as Dibra. So he seems to be asking if the Balkoyer himself can say Akdamus, and the Maharam Rotenberg says no, you can't have the Balkoyer say Akdamus. Why not? Because the Mishnah says in Megillah that the Balkoyer himself is not allowed to assist the Maturgaman, so that people shouldn't think that the Targum is written in the Torah. So already from the Maharam Rotenberg we're seeing an association between Akdamus and Targum of the Torah. Now, this minhag of being Metargum the Torah on Shishal Pesach and on Shavuos came to more clear light with the publication of Machzor Vitri. Machzor Vitri is a very important sefer, it's like from the base Medrash of Rashi, Rabbi Simcha Vitri. Even though we knew about it for many years, it was only first published in the Tov Reish Nuns, that's in the 1890s. So Rabbi Heidenheim, for example, did not have access to the Machzor Vitri, and so now that we have Machzor Vitri, there's a lot more that we're able to determine exactly what was going on over here, and what Akdamus and what the Targum and what it's actually all about. What is a reshus? We saw before in the manuscript that the Targum, the Akdamus, is a reshus l'maturgaman. A reshus is every type of piyut has a name. For those who are, for the Chabad listeners, you may be familiar in the back of the Chabad, the Slichas, the Rabbi has the various things, notes, to determine exactly what different things in the Slichas are, and you see how every single one has a name. There's a Shnia, there's a Shalmonis, there's a Pisman, there's a Psicha, there's an Akeda, there's I think it's called a Shnia and a Shlishia or Shlishis or something like that, and etc., etc. Often you might hear Piyutim referred to as Yotzrus, which is a general originally Yotzerus was referred to, the original term of Yotzerus meant a piyut that was recited in the bracha of Yotzer, in the first bracha of Birchas Kriyishma. Then there's piyutim which are called Ahavos, which were said in the second bracha of Kriyishma. There's a Zulas, there's an Oifon, there's a Geula, there's a Kedushta, there's etc., etc. Every type of piyut has a precise name. A Rishus is an opening piyut, but specifically, to differentiate it, for example, perhaps from a psicha, a Rishus is specifically said before you're going to say an interruption, which is at a part of davening where you're not really supposed to interrupt. So, for example, famously, we say, even in Chabad, we do say the piyutim on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Now, really, in the middle of Chazaras Hashatz, it's not really a time to interrupt. And so, before we say the piyutim, we say Misoyit Chachamim Unavoinim Umelamed Das Mevinim, and then continue with Asisi Lechanunach, which is basically saying almost a disclaimer of sorts that we are going to be interrupting to say these piyutim. And so that's really what Akdamus is, even though we no longer have a Meturgaman, and we're no longer in the custom of interrupting in the middle of Kriyas Torah to say Targum, and especially nowadays people don't understand Aramaic necessarily, but that's what Akdamus originally is. It's a Rishus for the Meturgaman to say. Now, right away, there's obviously going to be a little bit more details over here, but right away, everything suddenly falls into place. We understand why originally it was instituted to be said after the first pasuk, because that's when the Turgoman was starting his job. So before he started Targum, he said the Rishus for the Targum. We also understand why it's in Aramaic. That was one of the questions which is discussed. Why is this piyut? We don't say any other piyutim in Aramaic. Why is this one specifically in Aramaic? And that's the reason, because that's the language that the Turgoman is speaking. We also, let's look at some more details in the Machzor Vitri, and then some more things will come to light as well. So in the Machzor Vitri, it starts off, for example, in Siman Reish Tzadik Tes, we have after the first pasuk of B'chodesh HaShlishi, it brings the Targum, V'yarchet Lisah L'mipak B'nei Yisrael Mi'ad Mitzrayim, etc. Then it goes on, it has the whole Targum for the whole first few aliyahs, and then we get to the Aseres HaDibros themselves. Now over there, two things change. First of all, the Targum is no longer just the literal word-for-word translation of Unclus, but he moves on to what we call Targum Yonason or Targum Yerushalmi, which is a much more elaborate translation, which is much more than a translation. It includes midrashim and all sorts of things connected to the Aseres HaDibros. And additionally, before the Targum of each of the Aseres HaDibros, there is a piyut. There is another piyut in Aramaic, and all of these are produced properly in Machzor Vitri, starting from Siman Shin Beis. I'm sorry, no, that's what the Targum is, but they are in the Machzor Vitri, and also all of these other piyutim can be found in the previously mentioned Machzor from Rabbi Frankel, the Talmud of Rabbi Goldschmidt, and all these piyutim are called dibros, right? Every type of piyut has a name. A piyut that was said as an introduction to the Targum on any given one of the Aseres HaDibros was called a dibra, and that's also, of course, why the Maharil is referring to Akdamus as a dibra, because the Rishus for the Meturgaman. So you have the 10 piyutim of dibros, and the 11th one is the introductory Rishus piyut called the dibra of Akdamus Milim. One of those piyutim, one of the dibros, is a piyut that starts with the word arkin. If you have the Machzor of Goldschmidt, it can be found, of Frankel, it can be found on the Eitzar Chachma. That is on page 570, I believe. No, sorry, 570 is Yitzif Piskom, whereas arkin is on page 397. So on page 397 in the Goldschmidt Machzor, it says and now we're about to start the Aseret Dibros, and we start a piyut, another Aramaic piyut, which starts with the words Arkin Hashem Shemaya L'Sinai V'Amar L'Moshe Mehemne Tosuk, etc. And that when that one finishes, the Balkaira continues saying the Aseret Dibros, and then there's the piyutim that go through. I'm sorry, so Arkin is actually another introductory one before the first Dibros of the Aseret piyut of the Aseret Dibros. Choloifen, Arkin actually is still recited in not nowhere nearly as common as Akdamus, but I believe there are machzorim, contemporary machzorim, where Arkin is printed, and there are some communities who still say Arkin. Now, it's interesting to note that Tosfos mentioned that the reason why we say Targum in those days has to do with Pirsumei Nisa, and it's interesting to note that, like I just mentioned, that specifically on the Aseret Dibros and also on Shlish Pesach for the actual Shira of Az Yashir, the Machzor Vitri moves away from Targum Onkelos and brings Targum Yonason. So obviously Targum Yonason, like I said, includes all those midrashim, so very much fits the theme of the Pirsumei Nisa, which is the basis for their entire minhag. Now, I mentioned before that in Vermaisa itself, I believe I mentioned, they did not say Akdamus, and the way it's worded in the Minhagi Vermaisa is Ein Omrim Poi Akdamus V'Yitziv Piskam V'Arkin. Now, many people who discussed Akdamus over the generations were wondering why is it that Dafka in Vermaisa, which is the home base of Akdamus, that's where Meir Shatz was from, they would not say it. And in fact, in one of the versions of Minhag Vermaisa, he says, I once heard that there was once a chazan who said Akdamus with a kol noim b'kavana gedola, with a beautiful voice and much kavana, and after he finished, he immediately passed away, and that's the reason why in Vermaisa they stopped saying Akdamus. And the author over here writes that the author is the real Kirchoim. I didn't have a chance to look up exactly who that is, but he writes that this reason is not good enough to me. If such a story occurred, then it's a very special tefillah, so they should dafka say it. But now that we understand the whole history of Akdamus, it's very clear why they didn't say it in Vermaisa, because because they had such specific minhagim, they actually understood what Akdamus was originally all about, and so their minhag was that since we are no longer doing the Targum, we should no longer say the Rishus for the Turgaman. And in the very same sentence, they say we don't say Yitziv Piskam and Arkin, which Yitziv Piskam is for the second day of Shavuos. It's kind of very similar to Akdamus. There's kind of a parallel discovery about Yitziv Piskam as there is to Akdamus, which might be for another time, and Arkin, which, like I said, is one of the piyutim for the Turgaman. So it's clear that they understood the context of what Akdamus was, and they stopped saying it when the minhag of Targum on Shavuos also sort of fell to the wayside. Now, how and why did this minhag change? So it's unclear exactly when, but it can be traced. You can see in various machzorim, manuscript machzorim that are available nowadays, that you could see how things were changing. So firstly, you have you'll find the machzor where they took out the Targum and the whole Kriyas HaTorah, but they left the Targum just for the Aseret Dibros, which was the main point, like we saw before in Tosfos, and they also left the Targum just of the very first pasuk B'Chodesh HaShlishi in order for the Rishus to make any sense. So they left the first pasuk of the Targum. Then you have later machzorim where they've taken out the Targum of Aseret Dibros, but they just left in just the Targum of the first pasuk, again for the same reason, to make the Rishus, the Akdamus, have any sense for it to be there. But then, as time goes on and manuscript machzorim became less common and printed machzorim were becoming more in use, so over the generations, the minhag of Targum fell completely to the wayside, to the extent that by the time it came to the Taz and many of his contemporaries, like we saw before, the Shar Ephraim and others, they have no idea what Akdamus was originally about, and so they are perturbed by it, and even making perhaps a suggestion to change it, to say it before Kriyas HaTorah. Now I should point out that it's very possible that even if the Taz did know what Akdamus was about, he would have said to say before Kriyas HaTorah, because nowadays that we're not saying it, so to speak, as a Rishus, because we're not doing the Targum anymore. So nowadays Taka should be changed, and Taka is, like the Taz says, nothing to do with Kriyas HaTorah, and therefore should be said beforehand. I believe that this pretty much summarizes the overall topic of Akdamus. Like I said, there's also Yitziv Piskam, which is also a Rishos for the Haftarah on the second day, and perhaps another time we'll discuss Yitziv Piskam.